Who will win the Koli Point rat race? We look at the battle to contain Shoji's forces who have landed east of Henderson Field.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Welcome back to the show. This episode, number 150, looks at the action that became known as the Koli Point rat race. This is the 16th episode in our Guadalcanal series with Dave Holland, the expert on the Guadalcanal campaign. Before we get back into it, I want to reflect on a couple of points that were raised in last week's episode. So we looked at naval logistics and the ability to supply the troops on Guadalcanal, and how the US Navy was able to do a much better job than the Imperial Japanese Navy. However, they didn't have it all their own way. On the 26th of October, 1942, the troopship President Coolidge was entering the harbour at Espiritu Santo. She had departed San Francisco on the 6th of October, bound for New Caledonia, carrying the 172nd Infantry Regiment of the 43rd Infantry Division, along with a harbour defence unit. Her sailing instructions made no mention of the defensive minefield protecting the harbour. Captain Henry Nelson, concerned about submarines, chose the most direct approach into the harbour. The ship struck two mines, the first near the engine room, and seconds later another beneath the stern. With the ship taking on water fast, Nelson attempted to beach her. There were 5,340 men who were able to get off. Two, however, died in the sinking. One was a stoker in the fire room who was killed when the mine exploded. The other was Captain Elwood Hewitt of the 103rd Field Artillery Regiment. He had already disembarked safely but returned to the ship after hearing that patients were trapped in the infirmary. He succeeded in rescuing them but was unable to escape himself. He would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The troops had been told that salvage operations would be conducted once the ship was secured, so no one took their personal weapons ashore. After evacuation was complete, however, the ship slid backwards into the channel and sank in approximately 20 metres of water. With her went all of the regiment's equipment, their personal weapons, and a major shipment of quinine. In total, there was 591 pounds of quinine, or 268 kilograms. That represented almost all of the quinine in US stocks at the time. The loss of quinine production drove a dramatic expansion in the manufacture of Atibrine, a synthetic antimalarial drug. This effort was a critical research and development project within the United States, and it came second only to the Manhattan Project. By 1943, the United States was producing approximately 1.8 billion doses of Atibrine. This scale of production was critical not only for operations in the Pacific, but also for the campaigns of North Africa and the Mediterranean, where malaria also posed a serious threat to combat effectiveness. The second issue that we want to think about is the considerations for command and control under Vandergrift. By early November 1942, Vandergrift is commanding the 1st Marine Division, and that's fair, he is the divisional commander, but he is also the senior ground commander of all forces within the Lunga perimeter. He's got the 164th Infantry Regiment of the Americal Division. This is the first US Army unit committed to the defense of Guadalcanal. He's got the 147th Infantry Regiment, that's the Ohio National Guard. They're providing airfield security and defense of key installations. Now, he's had some elements of the 2nd Marine Division with him since the landings on August 7th. But the build-up of the 2nd Marine Division, that is going to continue until all of the elements of the 2nd Marine Division are in Guadalcanal. Not only that, the 25th Infantry Division, they are also on their way. Overlaying this increasingly complex ground picture is the Cactus Air Force. Formerly, the air forces on Guadalcanal don't sit under Vandergrift's command. They fall within the broader naval South Pacific Air Command structure. However, the Cactus Air Force operating from Henderson Field, that airfield is within Vandergrift's defensive perimeter. He's responsible for the airfield's protection. And he also needs that very tight relationship for all of the close air support missions that the Cactus Airfield is punching out. In practice, this requires very tight coordination. So we see Vandegrift operating a joint, multi-service, and increasingly multi-division force, all while operating from a divisional headquarters never designed to manage formations of this size or complexity, which raises a critical question. When should a corps-level headquarters be established, and where will the necessary resources come from? Corps-level enablers, engineering assets, the heavy artillery, logistics, medical support, and a properly staffed headquarters with the horsepower to be able to control so many moving parts. That certainly cannot be improvised indefinitely out of a divisional headquarters. By early January 1943, the scale of forces on Guadalcanal make the issue untenable. The Americal Division fields approximately 16,000 men. The 25th Infantry Division will have 12,500, and the 2nd Marine Division approximately 14,500 men, giving a total ground strength of roughly 50,000 personnel on the island. This is definitely corps-sized. Yet, until December, the entire ground effort is being coordinated through Vandegrift's divisional staff, which puts a lot of strain on those staff officers to manage operations, logistics, reinforcements, force flow, and joint coordination simultaneously. It's best to have a nice, clean C2 situation rather than running into the kind of issues that Hayakatake, who was commanding the 17th Army, which is effectively a corps-level formation, he's attempting to control dispersed operations from a rudimentary headquarters near Cochabamba with minimal staff support, while bearing responsibility for the Kokoda campaign as well as the Guadalcanal campaign. You've got a commander overburdened, probably under-aware of what is happening with the forces underneath him, pushed well and truly beyond sustainable limits. We'll look at future episodes at the activation of 14th Corps in early January and the command structure that brings. But I think it's important to think about these things because Vandegrift is definitely playing catch-up, and I think, potentially, so will his successor. So we'll get back to our interview with Dave Holland now. Last week, we discussed how the Japanese, with their predilection for littoral manoeuvre, had landed Colonel Shoji with 1,500 troops to the east of Henderson Field. So most of the action has been to the west on the Matanakau. They're looking to exploit surprise. They're looking to be able to exploit weaknesses in the perimeter at Henderson Field to the east. Let's get back to our interview with Dave now. So how did the effort to box them in go?
Well, they call it the Koli Point rat races. That's what it was known as because they just couldn't trap them. And finally, they boxed them in at Gavaga Creek. And they used some amphibious assaults, and they went around the Gavaga Creek and landed. They ended up boxing the Japanese in, almost. They had them on the east side, the west side, but the south side, there was about a 500-yard gap through the swamp. And the Army was covering that area. At that stage, once they boxed them in, the rest of the 164th pulled back into the perimeter and just left one battalion in the Army under Marine Command, the 2nd of the 164th. They had the carriage of that bottom part of the pocket, which had that 500-yard gap. They weren't able to close that gap. It took them at least 2 days to close it. And by that time, a number of Japanese had escaped through there. You read accounts that, the thing about the Koli Point, in my new book, I had to really do a lot of research about Koli Point. Very confusing battle. You read accounts that a whole Japanese regiment, 3,000 men, escaped through here. I've been to Koli Point. I've been to Gavaga Creek. You're not going to put 3,000 Japanese in there. And if you look at the records of what the Japanese, the 230th, on paper you think, oh, it's a whole regiment's got 3,000 men. But no, there were only 2 battalions. They were reduced. And then you had another company of Japanese that landed. And you know that the majority of the troops already moved out. They're on the way south, heading out. In my opinion, from doing a good analysis of it, I think the Marines and the Army trapped the rear guard. I think they left about 450 men for rear guard, probably about 400 men for rear guard, and then they trapped the rear guard before they could leave. And then you had the sick and wounded that couldn't leave either. So that's when you had roughly about 450 to 500 Japanese in that pocket. That's easily more understandable because you only had 3 American battalions. Not going to trap a whole regiment in there, and it's not big enough to put a regiment. So they didn't let 3,000 escape, like you read in some accounts. Shoji was already gone. Some of the Japanese were moving through. We know that. But anyway, they ended up closing the gap, moved through, and wiped out the pocket. And when they wiped out the pocket, the Americans lost no one. So that tells me a lot of the Japanese were dead because they're hitting them with artillery, 75 millimeters, or hitting when they were gunfire, they hit 155 millimeters, mortars. They're smashing the hell out of them. And I think a lot of the Japanese, like I said before, were sick and wounded already. Either they killed themselves or someone killed them or they just died from sickness. So that's why when the Americans went in that pocket, no casualties. And there was, reading the accounts, there wasn't much of a mop-up of live people. So yeah, that was the Koli Point, Gavaga Creek. And that was where battalion commander, like our Army battalion commander was fired in the field. Controversial.
There was two of them, wasn't there, I think?
No, there's one battalion commander fired and some company commanders fired. And it was very unique because they're under Marine command at that stage. And then Seabury, that's what I was going to say. Seabury was in command then because Rupertus got sick from dengue fever. He went down, and because you had an observer there, they go, oh, we got a spare brigadier. You're in charge now. So I think when because the Marines thought two of the company commanders wasn't up to snuff, the Army company commanders under Sims, and he told the Army battalion commander, fire them. And the Army battalion commander says, no, they're good men. I won't do it. But I think due to service protocol, Sims, instead of firing the Army commander, goes straight to Seabury. He says, I think you need to speak to your boy over there and pull him in line. So Seabury's, the brigadiers went to the lieutenant colonel and said, look, you need to fire these two guys. And he says, no, that he stood up for him. A bit of moral courage. He goes, well, then you're fired. So him and, one company commander were fired. But a year later, see that battalion commander, he goes to the American Division staff, and he does quite well the rest of the war. But yeah, he stood up for his guys because he'd been in the National Guard unit for like 17 years, rose up from a private all the way up to lieutenant colonel. Interesting to see the moral courage there to look after his subordinates. He stood up for his. But yeah, that was something you won't find in many books. Yeah, I had to find the original documentation for messages. Very, very interesting when you read it. But anyway, that ended the Battle of Koli Point. So about 450 Japanese are dead. The rest of them are moving. So you got Shoji, resupplied Shoji column, roughly about maybe 1,500 guys. They're moving south, and they're moving toward Lunga to meet up with the upper Lunga to establish a base camp there. And then once that's finished, this is roughly the 11th, 12th of November. This is 11th of November. So once they had them in the pocket, Vandiger says, okay, we've trapped them in a pocket. I know roughly how many Japanese you're dealing with. So he's giving the green light to Arthur at the Botanical, recommence your operation. And by this stage, the 8th Marine Regiment, a fresh regiment, had landed on the fort. So the 8th Marines had went up to the Botanical. And then I seen a message that told Seabury, as soon as it's finished, you go there and make sure Bill Whaling, because Bill Whaling was made his chief of staff, a Marine chief of staff, I think just to help him out a bit. The message says, okay, now proceed, take charge of the western sector and take Whaling with you. That's what the message says. So Arthur had kicked off the offensive on the 10th of November to recommence the offense, and they're moving quite well. By midday on the 11th of November, they were like 1,000 yards from Kukumbana. The Japanese were panicking. You read the Japanese reports. Everybody said, this is over with. They're throwing everyone they could get into the thing. Another little point there. I'm taking it back from the 4th Battle Botanical. I was talking about from the 1st to the 3rd of November. At one stage, at the 3rd of November, the Japanese started panicking. They go, well, what about the Americans about to break through? Hakataki thought tanks were coming in. They were calling American tanks, but they're half-tracks with the guns. And Hakataki, it got so desperate that Hakataki went up himself to the front line. At that stage, on the 2nd, Vandergrift was at the front line command post. So I calculated it up. They were 1,500 yards apart from each other, two Army commanders. Something that you see like the 1800s. Two Army commanders are 1,500 yards apart on the battlefield together. So that was on the 2nd and 3rd. But anyway, when we go back brings up to the midday on 11th, the Marines and the Army, mainly the Marines, are very close to Kukumbana. It's almost over with. Potentially, this is it. This is the end. Potentially could be the end of the campaign, because once those 8th Marines push through, take Kukumbana, that cuts off that whole division. Almost there. But once again, seesaw battle. What comes in? More intel. And this time it was major intel. We've got a huge fleet with all these transports coming in. So this is the promised Japanese reinforcements, right? They're coming in. They're coming in with 11 transports. They're going to do it all in one hit. Instead of bringing them in piecemeal, they're going to come in, replicate what they did in mid-October. They're going to do battleship bombardment. They're going to suppress the airfield. They're going to hit it with massive airstrikes. And they're just going to dump 11 transports worth of troops and supplies all in one hit. And then they're just going to smash the Americans and proceed down the coast. What happened was, because of that massive threat, which they said, we're going to land potentially straight on the lunar perimeter, Vandergrift, which one of the biggest things he regretted in the campaign, he went up personally and gave orders to Arthur. He goes, we got to withdraw. And it was like, well, what's going on? What do you mean we got to withdraw? Because this is credible intelligence that says they're about to land a major fleet or major division, probably potentially a division at Lunga Point. We got to give up what we fought for in blood. So once they explained it that way, they moved back. It became a bit of a cluster because the 8th Marines had moved up. They'd built a major supply base, forward supply base on that side of Matanikau there, but they had to move back very quickly, and they left a lot of gear. There was one report from Lieutenant Colonel Twining, who was the operations commander of or operation officers of the 1st Marine Division. He told Thomas, the chief of staff, he goes, and I don't tell the old man, which is Vandergrift, he says, well, we got reports of like some mortars and heavy machine guns and some 37 millimeters left. It was left. They were just left. And he said, we won't tell him that. We'll just say there's some supplies left. So I don't know if Vandergrift ever knew. And so they pulled back. And instead of giving up everything, they left. They weren't going to give up the Matanikau for no reason. So they left the 8th Marine Regiment holding the east bank in Matanikau. They dug in. And those footbridges they'd built, they dismantled them. So all that fighting they had to do, they had to give it up. Now, this is an interesting point. You aren't reading a lot of books. Part of the 38th Division, the 228th Regiment, had already landed under a guy called Major General Ito, and he was the division's infantry group commander. So Ito had landed, and their job was to take back the east bank of Matanikau. That was their mission. So they watched the Americans on the 10th push, and they said, if we can hold them, the Americans are actually, as a long line, they're vulnerable because they're like extending themselves along this coast. So he took about 2,000 men under Ito, and they started paralleling in the ridges, potentially to cut the Americans off. So the Japanese were doing a counterplank. So when the Americans suddenly pulled up and pulled back, Hayakatake didn't know what was going on because he didn't know the Americans knew the fleet was coming in. So the only thing he could put it down to was, they've seen our column moving in interior. They've seen it, and they've pulled back to the threat. So that would have been a big what if they would come stringing out of those hills and hit that American vulnerable spot and potentially cut off a whole regiment of Americans up front. So that's something you won't read about too much in the histories because in most accounts, because it didn't occur. Hayakatake was counting on that. He goes, I'll just string out these Americans on this line because at that stage the coastal plain was very small. It's only 200 or 300 yards, maybe 400 yards from the ridge line to the sea. So the Americans are basically attacking almost battalion front with strung out. It was a good plan. But once they did it, the Japanese were happy because their whole objective was to take that side of Matanikau, and they had it in their hands. Ito was like, yeah, we got him.
Once again, though, we see that hubris because if they thought, is there a chance that the Americans are reading our mail, then that would be a very, very good reason to explain a withdrawal that was so close to success. But
they didn't think.
No.
They couldn't put it. They must have seen us. They didn't think, obviously, so arrogant and hubris that they can't not read our mail.
Oh, so a couple of other things happen. We've got Halsey comes out to actually look at Guadalcanal. This is something that Gormley never did. Provides him with a lot of information. He talks to a lot of Marines. He was described as being a breath of fresh air, but he also sees just the impact that the time in the jungle on Guadalcanal, as well as the logistics issues and how much the troops that have been there since the start, how diminished they were in their ability to generate combat power, how small some of those battalions were. Yeah,
so it gave him a first-hand indication of what was actually going there, and it obviously boosted a bit of morale. There's one point in his book, he talks about his staff officers when they're driving in the Jeep. They say, you need to stand up so that people can see you. And he goes, it's not about me. I'm a big note myself. That was the type of guy he was. But they all knew who he was anyway. They all started cheering, and he comes up. But he went to the front lines. He actually said he was a chicken because it was a night bombardment. He just stayed in his bunker the whole time. And he just said, I don't like artillery. I'm a chicken. But he's really a boost to morale there. And he gave him that firsthand indication of how bad. And he goes, these guys really need to be relieved. I'll do my best now to relieve these guys. They need help. They need to get out of there.
I think it really does highlight one of the differences between Gormley and Halsey, with the fact that he came out to have a look at what was actually happening in the decisive part of his AO.
Yeah, I still think Gormley, because his first mission he was given from day one was to guard the vital Australian to American supply line or communication line. So that was what he thought his primary objective was. And that and a number of other reasons, but I think he looked at Guadalcanal secondary. But if you read some of his stuff, I've got some of his contemporary writing. I mean, he knew the importance of Guadalcanal. He knew the importance of getting troops there, but I still don't know why he didn't visit. Apparently, he never got off his ship in Noumea Harbor either. I know he had some health issues and a few other things going down, stress and all that. But yeah, I don't think he was that type of leader to lead from the front inspirational.
So back out to the east, we've now got Shoji's force. Now, one of the things that's happened out there is Chesty Puller has been wounded. He was wounded
28. That's right before they could close right when they started moving to the pocket or to close the pocket out. They're maneuvering to trap the Japanese in the pocket. And his battalion was moving down the coast, and he had his command group, and he had his right flank in a thick swamp, and then left flank was kind of on the coast, but the right flank was slowing up. And Puller was in the thick jungle. He couldn't see what the hell was going on. So he said he moved out onto the beach with his command group. At that stage, the Japanese, when they'd landed with this fresh reinforcements, they landed 2 75mm mountain howitzers. They had him at Gavaga Creek. If you go to Gavaga Creek, you go where he's wounded, he stands out on the beach. You could just see this cluster of men, maybe radios and whatever, antennas, and bang. They fired a few rounds in there and struck his group and killed a few and wounded quite a number, including Puller. He was severely wounded. They took shrapnel, especially in his leg, groin, his arms. He was down. He was trying to get some artillery fire going. And the first time he called out, because he had a field phone wire, didn't have radios, everything was running field phones. That was the quickest way to get it. So he went out, the field phone wire was spliced, his communicator was down, so he's crawled out wounded, spliced the wire himself under fire, got a hold of the field phone, but the 10th Marines that was in support of the 75mm artillery hadn't moved in position yet. And he couldn't get close air, so he had to wait. So he waited another 3 or 4 hours. And then he could get the artillery in position. And he called some artillery rounds to basically suppress the Japanese. But he was severely wounded. He needed to be evacuated, but he didn't have anyone to replace him. The next guy was a captain. And that's what he said. He goes, 1, I didn't want to leave my men. 2, there was no one to adequately replace me at this time. And then he says, get me a replacement up here. I'll leave. So all that night, they couldn't get a replacement that night. Then next morning one was coming up, but all that night he stayed in his foxhole basically and directed the combat. And that next morning he couldn't move. They pulled him out of the hole because he was just so stiff and wounded. They sent a major up. Major relieved him, but they had a stretcher. They were going to put him on a stretcher, and he goes, no, I don't want my men to see me on a stretcher. So he hobbled into the landing craft. But there was one story, which I believe, one of the corpsmen came up to put a medical tag on him. He goes, I'll take that bag or that tag and put it on some medicine bottle, leave me alone. They put him in the transport, took him back to Lunga, put him in the hospital, emergency surgery, took out pieces of shrapnel. And there was one big chunk of shrapnel near his thigh or his femur. And the doctor says, we got to fly you in Kazovac to New Caledonia to get that out. And he goes, can I live with it? He goes, yeah, you can live with it, but it definitely needs to come out. He goes, when I was growing up in Virginia, I remember all these old men, Confederate veterans with, what do you say, with like a ton of Yankee rust in them. So I'll be okay. And then, he about 2 or 3 weeks later, he was back up, running around. He didn't leave. But unfortunately, that wound came back to haunt him in Ballapallaloo in 1944 because his legs swelled up like twice its size. He had an infection, and potentially that was probably one of the things that impacted his judgment and his health at Peleliu. In fact, some people even say it probably saved him at Peleliu because he's pretty much immobilized. In normal Puller, he's up running around, visiting foxholes, running around all the time. They said if he would have done that at Peleliu, he'd probably died or been shot. So away at Peleliu, after he had that fever, when they pulled the regiment, what was left of his regiment out, they did emergency surgery on the ship before they could move out to stabilize it. So yeah, that was the only time it is 38-year combat career. He was a wounded man who'd been in probably hundreds of firefights, especially in the Banana Wars.
Incredible from someone who certainly didn't shirk from the responsibility of commanding from the front.
No, he's more like a sergeant, I think. He was good. Be a good company commander, a good battalion commander. Then once out of battalion, I think that was at the Peter principle. What they say he'd make a good battalion commander, even though he retired as lieutenant general. But still, that's a controversial figure in himself. Puller.
So Shoji's withdrawing, and he is pursued by Carlson's raiders. When did they get into the AO?
Yeah, so they landed on November 4th at Aola. Aola was another 20 miles to the east, and that was Richmond Kelly Turner, the admiral, wanted to build an airfield at Aola. He said, well, okay, we'll build an airfield at Aola. That will give us another big airfield on Guadalcanal. If you ever have to move away from Henderson, we'll have that, and plus the fighters can have more time to scramble. So Vandegrift and the rest of his guys knew that it wasn't feasible to build it there due to the terrain. But this is when Halsey had just taken over. I think Turner had actually talked him into it. And Halsey later said, look, this is the last time I'll make sure I'll do proper or have any proper information before I make a decision like this. But anyway, they landed CB Battalion, they landed some of the 147th Infantry Regiment of the Army, and they landed, I think, 2 companies of the Raiders. The Raiders landed first to secure the beachhead, and they were met by Coast Watcher Martin Clemens and some of his men that already set the beach up. So there was no Japanese there, landed unopposed. That was their mission, potentially to guard it. And then once the Vandegrift had that threat on his east flank, I think 2 days or 3 days after the Raiders were there under Lieutenant Colonel Carlson, they flew over in a dive bomber and dropped a message. That's what he used to do. Sometimes they drop little capsules or messages from the dive bombers. They dropped it with a little streamer on it and picked it up, and it says, your mission now is to take your men and proceed with a reconnaissance patrol and move all the way, looking for the enemy all the way until the perimeter. That was his first job. So they took off, and then probably a few days later, then they were given a mission. Once the Marines had trapped the Japanese in Gavaga Creek. Well, no, before that, they were looking at potentially get the Raiders to get in a landing craft and land on the other side of Gavaga Creek. But that stage, the Marines already made it. So they said, okay, go to a place called Buin, which is a little village, and form a patrol base there. Form a patrol base and sent companies out to look for the Japanese and meet up with the Marines at Gavaga Creek because he got the Japanese in his pocket. So that was where it put him there. And then when this was on the 11th and the Japanese had broken out, then his mission changed. They had a bit of a battle at a place called Asamana. They hit some of the Japanese coming out. Then his mission was changed. Okay, now follow this Japanese retreating column and perform guerrilla techniques on them. Just follow them, see where they're going, and harass them. And then that was in their element. That was what especially Carlson's Raiders were kind of, I guess you could say, born to do. One of their main missions, guerrilla style fighting.
What do we know about Evans Carlson?
Yeah, there's books written about him. So basically, he came in pre-World War I in the U.S. Army National Guard. I think he came in as a private. But he ended up commissioned. He was an artillery captain in the First World War, the U.S. Army. And then after he left the U.S. Army and First World War was over, he went into the Marines, and they said, well, you can't come in as an officer. You come in as a private. So he joined the Marine Corps as a private. He wasn't a private that long. Then he picked up a commission. And then he did typical interwar Marine positions, staffing positions, the military education. I think he went to Nicaragua or Honduras or Haiti, Nicaragua. I think he did a stint, maybe Nicaragua. But at one stage, I know, then he was sent to China, and because he was associated with China. And he went to China in the China Marines and the 4th Marines, and he came back. And then he picked up a stint, which is very influential to him, as the guard of the commander of the Camp David Guard. And Camp David was a retreat for the president, FDR, Roosevelt, at Camp David. So Carlson was the commander of the Marine Guard there, so he got to know him. Him and his son, James Roosevelt, got to know him quite well. FDR had a thing that he would send out people to report directly to him. He would send out like these little reconnaissance people all around the world. And Carlson became one of them. And he sent Carlson, and Carlson operated out of the U.S. Embassy in China, the Naval Intelligence. He was sending letters straight back to FDR, to the president. He was circumventing his whole chain of command. It was some crazy times. But he was reporting directly to the president. And he was a captain, I think, at the time. And then he hooked up with Mao Zedong, as an observer of Mao Zedong's army, and they did their what they call it, 100-day march or whatever, the famous march,
The long march.
Long march. He went on the long march with him, parts of it, and there he studied the Chinese communists, how they fought, guerrilla tactics, how they're fighting the Japanese, and he was learning a lot of stuff. And then he went back to the States and basically got out of the Marine Corps. And then when the war came, he was recommissioned. But at that stage, you got to remember, then the Americans were looking at the British commandos, and FDR says, I want to form my own commando group. So this long story short, we don't have that much time. So hence the 1st and 2nd Raiders were born. I need someone to command one of the battalions, and I don't know if Carlson was doing his own politicking, but he goes, I need an unorthodox type of officer, because he was an unorthodox type of officer. He wasn't a standard officer, and that's why he said a lot of the regular officers and Marines officers didn't like him, couldn't stand him. But yeah, he was picked to lead that 2nd Raider Battalion, and he did their training along the lines of the Japanese communist guerrillas, how they fought. And that was what they designed to do. Very unique, come up with some very innovative tactics, actually, thinking outside the box.
Yeah, there was a phrase that was said about him. He may be red, but he's certainly not yellow.
He was brave.
And he was very egalitarian as well.
Oh, yeah.
Once again, he picked up from his time with Mao's army.
Yeah, they didn't use ranks. A lot of times they addressed each other by their ranks. He would have like a democratic meeting. It's like an officer. He'd bring them all together. They'd go, what do you think about this, Private? He'd get everyone's view before they make a decision. And they referred to each other by first names. And yeah, we're all in it. They used to give them lectures, why are we fighting? What's the reason for fighting? And like that, political lectures. He would do that too. Oh, yeah.
He was also innovative in infantry minor tactics. Do you want to talk us through just quickly what he did from a weaponry and the formation of the basic Raider platoon in 2nd Raiders? Yeah,
so one thing is, I guess it helps being having the president's son as your battalion executive officer, which is Captain James Roosevelt Major James Roosevelt was his executive officer. So you can imagine they got all the best kit, best gear. They got boots, these good civilian boots, these Bowie top knives, all these assault vests. They got their weapons. They got M1 Garands. They got Thompsons. But what he did was he looked at the standard infantry squad and he goes, well, we're not designed like a standard infantry squad. We've got different missions. So how can I effectively use my men? So I'll form fire teams. I'll break them into 3-man fire teams. And that would give me 3 elements and a fire team, which at the time fire teams didn't exist. The Marines had a squad. You'd have a squad leader and something like 9 guys. They couldn't operate independently. It's just 1 squad leader, 1 corporal, and 9 privates, all operating as a group. So what he said, let's form up in 3-man teams so I can have 3 separate elements and all can support each other. Say, for example, I have what we all modern military Western forces do nowadays. I'll have like 2 could be my maneuver element, another one would be my base fire element. Fire and maneuver. Then they'll interchange. Gives them, each squad had 3 independent acting elements, all under a squad leader, but each one had a fire team leader. And later in 1944, the Marine Corps as a whole adopted it with 4-man fire. They call them 4-man fire teams, which, well, when I was in, that's what we had. I don't know what they do nowadays, probably something similar. But yeah, that's the way they did it. And then what he did was he beefed each one of them with so much firepower. So each fire team of 3 men had a Thompson, an M1 Garand, and a BAR. So every squad had 3 BARs, did 3 Thompsons, and 3 M1s, with the squad leader with an M1. Now, one of them had a rifle grenade, a grenadier with 1903. So, yes, that was one of the techniques that really impacted the Marine Corps from years on, from just his fire team concept, which is, as we know, it's a great concept.
Carlson was lucky to make it to Guadalcanal because he had led the Macon raid. That didn't really go as planned. Do you want to just talk us quickly through the Macon raid?
Yeah, very quickly. So the Macon raid was August the 17th and 18th of 1942, and it was designed to basically take some of the heat off Guadalcanal, take the interest off Guadalcanal. That was expected because Guadalcanal was the 7th. And they wanted the Japanese to think, they landed on all these islands and just maybe send their forces to elsewhere. So it's supposed to be a quick in and out raid. It was kind of the first time they were using rubber boats off submarines. They had 2 big submarines. Carlson stripped his guys down. I think he had like 200, maybe 220, 230 guys. Probably not that, roughly about 200, I think. Enough to get into 2 subs. They went in rubber boats. They had a little problems going in, but some of the boats were swamped. They got in there. They wiped out a garrison of Japanese, under 100. I think it was about 80 to 100 Japanese. They went in there. They basically killed all the Japanese. And then on the way out, that's where the issues came. The weather conditions were so bad, they couldn't find the boats. It was raining. The swell was bad. It swamped a number of boats. They didn't think they were going to get out. At one stage, they said, we're going to have to surrender. It would turn into a massive cluster, really, just a confusing mess, you can imagine. They end up getting out, but they left something like, I think, 12 or 13 Marines behind. They didn't know. They thought they were accounted for. And unfortunately, those Marines were captured later and shipped to another island. They killed them all. The Japanese executed them all. I think their graves were found not too long ago. I'll say not too long ago. I mean, probably 10 years. And yeah, so there were some lessons learned there, but with small boat training and a few other things. And now, it was good propaganda at the time. It was used to say, look, it boosted the morale of the public. But I think the people who knew, the powers to be, the public didn't know. They knew it was a bit of a fiasco, chaos. And also, too, you'll find out in 1943 at Tarawa with the Gilbert Islands, what it made the Japanese do, they made them really reinforce the Gilbert Islands. And the Marines had to pay for part of that. And when they took Tarawa in November 43 with the mass casualties because the Japanese beefed it up. So that was the Macon raid. And once again, it didn't make Carlson look too well. I was surprised that he actually kept it. A lot of people were surprised he kept his job. But yeah, once again, he had top cover. But yeah, it wasn't that great.
The fact that he attempted to surrender and it was only the fact that the Japanese messenger was accidentally shot by Marines who didn't realise that they were trying to surrender doesn't bode well, and actually shows a little bit of lack of that special forces kind of dedication to the mission, despite the odds.
Later to see who he was before and after. And so there's been obviously books written about it, and it wasn't a good start. It didn't paint him in a good light.
Do you want to talk us through then? So Shoji is withdrawing, followed by Carlson's raiders, and this is termed the Long Patrol. What was the Long Patrol?
You hear written popular, I guess, perception is 30-day long patrol behind enemy lines, which isn't correct. They landed on the 4th of November, like I said, and they were moving. And there's only 2.5 companies. The other companies were coming in later during the march. There's only, like I said, 2.5 companies. 2 more joined him about a week later. But at the 13th of November, it's when they're given the green light. Right from 13th to November, they're given the green light to go after Shoji. So that's what they did. And he sent his companies out. So what they did, they were very good at communication. He was praised by the division as being a good communicator. He's always sending reports in, Carlson. Say, for example, you got Puller and Hannikin. They're very frustrated. They said the division will pull the hair out because they said these old Banana War Marines, as soon as they left the wire, they cut off all comms. That's just the way they used to operate. But Carlson didn't. I mean, he was always sending the reports back. And they had the TBX radios. And they also had the walkie-talkies. I forgot the... And what he would do is he'd send each company out with a TBX radio and a walkie-talkie, and he would send them, he'd form a patrol base, he'd send them out in fans, and their job was to find the Japanese. And once they found the Japanese, because he'd made his raiders travel light, they can move very quickly and concentrate on the area. And he was using techniques, he'd studied the Japanese. So say, for example, if they found the Japanese dug in, or in an area, he would use, say, to have one company up front to engage the Japanese, and he'd leave just a platoon to the Japanese front. And he would send all these other companies to the Japanese sides and rear, whole full companies, something like Lee out of Chancellorsville. He'd leave his smallest force in front of the Japanese, and he'd send all his heaviest flanks to the sides. But he said, for some reason, he found the Japanese didn't really protect their sides and back. They didn't think the Americans could infiltrate like that as fast as the Japanese could. He says, I use their own techniques against them. He said, I'd hold them with a small unit up front, and I'd send all my units very fast to the sides and back. And he was doing that constantly, just hitting them, bang, 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 just following them. And then the second raiders, they were, quote, behind lines. You could say it was not, I wouldn't say behind lines. They were just basically no man's land. It was in front of their own lines, chasing Japanese. Their official report, Carlson's official report, they captured one prisoner. You can imagine, Carlson hated Japanese. He hated them with passion from China days and elsewhere. And the Japanese actually captured a couple of raiders on that patrol and basically butchered them. So there was no love lost there. But what they would do, a lot of times they were following the Japanese columns, a lot of sick and wounded Japanese. So they were just killing them left or putting them out of misery, so to speak. But they were capturing Japanese. And this is documented a number of times. In fact, it was kind of bragged about. They would question them and they'd kill them, get the information out, because they said, we're behind lines. I can't afford to take anyone back these Japanese. They were doing it to us. We was doing it to them. There was one stage where after Alsamana, where they found one of the Marines butchered. They'd captured 2 Japanese. And Carlson himself, he shot one of them in the head, and he told the other one, he said, "Then you boys, was that your good friend that was lost?" And 2 guys raised their hands and said, "Well, here, you take him in over there. You know what to do with him." So stuff like that. But they chased the Japanese. There's another point when they got to the 4th Japanese Air Hospital, which a lot of the raiders didn't, it haunted them to the day they died, because you read the official report, they caught 75 Japanese unaware without their weapons on the side of the bank. And Carlson had labeled it in his official report. He called it a hospital artillery unit. Okay. But if you read the Japanese side, most of these guys are something like 80, 60, something like that, just sick guys and wounded guys just laying on the ground, laying on their cots. Yeah, there's enough accounts on that. They said they basically killed them all. But once again, that's war, and these guys were operating in front of lines. They couldn't afford to, and plus there was no love lost in that brutal campaign. You can't judge them. That's just the way it was, because the Japanese would have done it to them in a heartbeat. But there was basically no court of rule, and the second raiders were playing by the Japanese gang. And then what they were doing, once they got to the Lunga, the mission changed again to find these, quote, pistol Petes, the artillery that was firing on the airfield. And they did find them. They found one of the 75 millimeters, and they destroyed it. And they found a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, which they destroyed. And then once they've done that, they've reached the bottom of Mount Austin. At that stage, Shoji's guys had already moved out. And then they went back to the perimeter. Another company, a fresh company came in. And then they were given another mission, go up top of Mount Austin and just see who's up there. And when you do that, come back to the perimeter. So yeah, they went up to the top of Mount Austin, did a bit of a reconnaissance, seen some Japanese positions, but hardly any Japanese there. Unfortunately, lost a few Marines who are still there in unmarked graves, and they came back down. So that ended on roughly about the first week in December, the 5th, I think, 6th, that ended their long patrol. So, but yeah, it became very well known. Like I said, he stripped these guys down. He had them eating like raisins and rice out of a sock. He put their all their rice mixed with raisins, just like eating like a Chinese. He thought they could survive like a Chinese on the Chinese diet, and they had the raisin socks. He'd give them 1 D-bar a day, which is like chocolate bar. That was what they lived on. And you read some of these raiders' accounts, you speak to some of the old second raiders now. I mean, he said this old man was trying to starve us to death, because he said this is what a Chinese peasant could live on. But not like a red-blooded, 6'4" red-blooded American at the time couldn't survive on that. But that was some of the things they used to do with the innovative tactics.
So Shoji would have started that withdrawal with about 3,000 soldiers, or was it not that high?
About 1,500. Remember, I said he didn't have a full regiment to start with. He only had 2 battalions, and plus a reinforced company had moved in. So I'd probably maybe 1,500, 1,600 at the most. The accounts, you'll read a lot of the accounts saying, they followed 3,000 or followed 4,000. There was nowhere near that. I think there are 400, maybe 500 Japanese are accredited of killing, but once again, that's just figures. I don't think they actually counted each one. And the raiders, I know they lost 16 raiders killed.
And so when Shoji finally got to 17th Army, he had 700 to 800 survivors, but critically, only 20 to 30 of them were fit enough to be able to fight. Yeah, and a lot of them died there once they reached Kukumana, because they paused at the upper Lunga. Then he got orders. You can imagine they got to go back up the Murayama Trail, and actually there was a few left. I'm going to do my army book. There was a few left at Bonigi in late January. There's a few in the 230th. Apparently, were still there running around. Not many actually evacuated in February. Yeah, it's that regiment. And that was another supposed to be a real fine regiment, the 230th. That was the one I was talking about in Henderson Field. They were specially designed to take airfields. That's what they did in Hong Kong and in Dutch East Indies. A good unit. So once again, we see the importance of the Matanikau. We see the Japanese still, I think you should never use hope as a task verb, but I think that they are hopeful of a victory based on probably some faulty assessments and a good deal of hubris at this point. And a lot more sophistication in the way that the Marines and the Army units are able to coordinate and exploit the interior lines of communication that they've got.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Dave. I think it's a once again, there's lots of lessons to come out of this about the importance of the logistics and just the long-term effects of operating in the jungle and just how it really does degrade everyone's capability to operate.
Yeah, exactly. And now we're starting to get into part of the campaign a lot of people don't know about. There's not really spoken much about. I think I talked about in the very beginning some of the myths of Guadalcanal and misconceptions. And after the Marines leave, the 1st Marine Division, the Marines never left. The 1st Marine Division leaves in early December. And we're getting to that stage now that there was nothing to happen, really. And there was really nothing happening in November. And we see, well, November will turn out to be the bloodiest month in the campaign for the Americans. And the next thing we'll talk about will be the 5th Battle of Matanical. That's kind of the Army gets to kind of run the show in conjunction with the Marines. But yeah, we'll start to see the changeover. And we're also seeing a changeover from a defensive posture, the Americans, to a full offensive posture. And then we're seeing, obviously, on the flip side of the Japanese, especially after that mid-November, their hopes are kind of like, failing. They went, okay, this is our big, now we're switching to a holding action, waiting for a next group of reinforcements that's coming in. Now we're starting to see the shift in the campaign where true American on offensive and the Japanese truly on the defensive. You know, what they're really known for really starts to come out.
Well, and I think that that's a really important point because not only do the American forces need to think about their offensive doctrine rather than their defensive doctrine, which has been proven to be quite strong, but they're going to be fighting an enemy that's going to be fighting in a different manner. So the Japanese, quite good in the offense, although with some weaknesses, I would argue much stronger in the defense.
Oh, yes, they're almost, they're geniuses on defense. And also, too, we're seeing both forces are getting to be spent. They're not offensively capable of moving. So now we're almost reaching a stalemate period. We're getting to both sides are just waiting for further reinforcements to come in. We're almost there. The Americans are starting to get reinforcements in. The rest of the Americal division is going to land. And that leads us up to the last week in November and the first weeks in December. And we'll see how that changes. We'll see if they're up to the task of offensive combat.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And we'll be back next week. Before we end up, and I know it's been a long episode, I think it's important to reflect on the career of Evans Carlson. Let's start with his time in China. And I think, isn't it fantastic that the Marine Corps was able to send officers for the kind of experience that Carlson got whilst he was in China? In 1937, he was serving as a military observer in Shanghai, where he read Edgar Snow's Red Star over China, the book that introduced the Western world to Mao and the Chinese communists. He was so enthralled by what he read that he got himself a military pass and travelled to Yan'an, which was the communist headquarters. There he met Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping. He developed a particularly close relationship with Zhu Di, the commander-in-chief of the 8th Rout Army. Over the next 8 months, Carlson travelled over 2,000 miles through enemy-occupied territory with units from the 8th Rout Army. He wasn't in the headquarters reading dispatches. He was living under the same conditions as the Chinese soldiers, marching and fighting alongside them against the Japanese. Carlson wrote in his book Twin Stars of China about one of the marches, which was 58 miles in 32 hours, and he wrote, "Perhaps the most striking feature of this march was the absence of straggling. The explanation lay in the ethical indoctrination of the individual. Each man possessed the desire to do what was right. It was right to perform his duty, and it was his duty to reach the destination with the column." This experience obviously had a profound effect on him and his thinking about leadership. He took away from his experience 3 important things. Firstly, the guerrilla tactics, the ability to disperse, concentrate rapidly, strike and disappear, hit the enemy where he's weak, avoid him where he's strong, use the terrain, use intelligence from the local population, move fast and light. Second, the egalitarian culture within the 8th Rout Army. There was no rigid distinction between officers and soldiers. And before every operation, the troops were briefed on the objective, their individual role, and the risks. After the operation, they conducted what would now be called an after-action review: what went right, what went wrong, and how this action connected to the broader campaign. This is quite a sophisticated command philosophy for an irregular force in the 1930s. And it does sound like it's got some elements of mission command, which we should all be familiar with today. The third lesson was political education. In the 8th Route Army, soldiers were taught why they were fighting. Carlson believed that a soldier who understood the moral purpose of the fight would be a better, more resilient soldier. He brought this directly to the second raters. He gave his men lectures on what they were fighting for. Carlson adopted the phrase gung-ho from the Chinese industrial cooperatives, meaning work together, as the second raters' motto. That phrase has entered the English language. It outlived Carlson, it outlived the raiders, and it outlived the war. That is not a bad cultural impact from a battalion commander. Some of his thinking did put him offside with some of his fellow Marine officers. He supported Mao's forces over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. He co-chaired a post-war organisation with Paul Robeson, and after his death in 1949, he was posthumously blacklisted by the House of Un-American Activities Committee. Both Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai sent letters of condolences to his family when he died. So he was quite unconventional in his political thinking. And the raiders themselves were viewed quite unconventionally. The Director of Plans and Policies described the raiders as hand-picked misfits, detrimental to the morale of other troops. Although many Marine Corps officers distrusted Carlson, they adopted his most important tactical innovation. That was the 3-man fire team. Each team had a BAR, a Thompson, and an M1 Garand, giving every squad 3 independent manoeuvre elements capable of fire and movement. The Marine Corps formally adopted that as a 4-man fire team in 1944. Another aspect of Carlson that I think is really interesting is that he maintained communication with divisional headquarters continually during the long patrol. He also used communications within the battalion, enabling the companies to operate independently but to come together when needed. He had better situational awareness of what was happening, and importantly, he was feeding that situational awareness back up to Vandergrift. That SA is really important. He's got contacts on his east, he's got contacts on the west, and he's got very little in the way of reserves. Compare and contrast with Puller and Hannikin, who were old banana war soldiers. They would go outside the wire and then they would cut communications. Carlson was innovative in some of the tactics that he developed, so he was quite adept at the flanking attack, which actually sounds quite like the way that the Japanese like to fight, and that's because he'd had experience with fighting the Japanese in China. Comes back to the old adage, know your enemy. I wonder what Shoji would have thought when he was experiencing these tactics for the first time. There's an apocryphal story about David Shoup and Evans Carlson. Shoup was with Carlson in China. He fought with him at Tarawa, and Shoup would be awarded the Medal of Honor there. Shoup was defending Carlson to a critic, and he said he may have been red, but he wasn't yellow. And that highlights the courage that Carlson had and the ethos that he brought to Carlson's raiders. Evans Carlson, like many leaders, is a complicated character. There's the spiritual low that he had on Makin Island. The failed withdrawal sees him lose hope and he attempts to surrender. And it's only because that surrender attempt goes awry that he then looks at the situation again and decides to have another attempt to get off the island. Amphibious withdrawals, whilst in contact, are difficult. This one, I think, is reminiscent of Biting, the Bruneval raid, where some of the commandos were left behind. The same thing happens in Macon. But the pressure would have been incredible, knowing that he had the president's son stranded with him on that island. There's also the treatment of prisoners on the long patrol. He would finish the war with 3 Navy Crosses and 2 Purple Hearts. As for the raider battalions themselves, they would not survive the war. In January 1944, Vandergrift had become the commandant of the Marine Corps, and he would disband the Marine Raider battalions. This was despite the work that Carlson's Raiders and Edson's Raiders had done in the defence of Guadalcanal. The fire team concept survived within the Marines. However, the egalitarian leadership model, the guerrilla capability, the emphasis on communications, political education, that was folded back into the conventional Marine Corps and diluted away. Why would Vandergrift do that? It's a really good question. Vandergrift personally awarded Carlson's battalion a unit citation after the long patrol, and he relied heavily on both of the Raider battalions during the Guadalcanal campaign, as we've seen. There were a number of reasons behind the disbanding of the Raider battalions. Firstly, manpower. In 1944, the Marine Corps was standing up the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. However, there was to be no expansion in the manpower within the Corps. The Marines for those two divisions needed to come from somewhere. Secondly, the war had changed. There was less requirement for the employment of special forces in deep penetrating raids like the Raider battalions were designed for. Secondly, the war had changed. It had transformed into a series of large-scale amphibious assaults against fortified islands. Tarawa, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Thirdly, the Raiders weren't being used as Raiders. Carlson's raid was one thing, but if we think about Edson's Raiders and their employment on Guadalcanal, they're being employed as conventional infantry. Edson's Ridge, Tulagi, and then later on, New Georgia and Bougainville, they weren't being able to utilise their specialised training. They were being utilised as light infantry. They were taking heavier casualties because of the fact that they lacked the heavy weapons that a standard Marine battalion had. Lastly, there was institutional opposition to an elite within the elite. This is an important, deeper cultural issue. Many Marine officers thought that the term Marine already meant elite. The previous Director of Plans and Policies had already proposed disbanding the Raiders as hand-picked outfits detrimental to morale and other troops. And when Vandergrift became Commandant on the 1st of January 1944, and Gerald Thomas, who shared this view, became Director of Plans and Policies, the institutional opponents were finally in charge. Admiral King concurred, and Vandergrift signed the order on the 8th of January. It wasn't until 2006, over 60 years, for the Marine Corps to re-establish a permanent special operations capability with MARSOC, the Marine Special Operations Command. In 2015, this was formalised when MARSOC units were officially redesignated as Marine Raider Battalions, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Marine Raider Battalions, along with the Raider Support Group and the Marine Raider Training Centre. MARSOC has drawn on the Raider history for unit identity, including the gung-ho ethos that Carlson had imprinted on Carlson's Raiders from Chinese communist guerrillas. Elements of the original Raider doctrine continue on, living off the land, extended independent patrols, and working through indigenous forces. Lastly, the organisational concepts. It's the Marine Corps' premier direct action special reconnaissance force designed to operate in small units behind enemy lines with a high degree of autonomy. So that's about it. This has been a really big episode. We've covered some really important ground. Join us next week when we return back to the Matanikau. This will be 5th Matanikau. We're going to be with the Army's 164th Regiment and the 8th Marine Regiment. Some excellent lessons in innovation coming up. Once again, if you've got anything out of this episode, please like or share it. If you see it on any of the socials, let us know how you're using it in your PME programs. And lastly, if you haven't checked out the Principles of War YouTube channel, definitely do yourself a favor. We're slowly going through the back catalogue, putting them on YouTube. I think the critical thing there, we've got some video which adds a little bit of life to it, but critically maps are going into the episodes as well. And a map often tells 1,000 words. So that's it. We'll be back next week.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.